Agricultural small and medium enterprises, SMEs, account for around 80% of food produced in developing countries and are a crucial source of employment, especially in rural areas. Yet, despite their importance, agricultural SMEs receive less than 10% of commercial bank lending and often find themselves in what is termed as the missing middle, in that they are too large for microfinance, but sometimes too small or considered too risky for traditional loans. Hello, everyone. I am Edna Kallon, and welcome to Audacity and Action, the podcast where we discuss how empowerment-centered, audacious ideas and transformative moves come together to create meaningful, lasting, positive change in the social impact space. My guest today is someone I could easily listen to for hours, given his wealth of experience in agri-food systems and international development. He most recently served as the regional program leader for Africa at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, where he provided strategic leadership for FAO's work across the continent. Dr. Ade Freeman, welcome to Audacity and Action. I couldn't be more excited to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Edna. It's my pleasure to join you. Let me just add my congratulations on founding Kallon Global LLC. It looks like you went back to that thrilling journey. I have no doubts that you're up to it.
Well, thank you very much. Coming from you, Ade, it's such a motivation. I am super excited to harness your knowledge, talk to you about your experience. I wanted to start our conversation by asking you if you could tell us a little about yourself and how you chose this career path.
I'm from Sierra Leone. I was born and raised the product of a public educational system. I went through a public elementary school, a public high school, and the University of Sierra Leone, which was a public university. So I'm a product of that system. At the University of Sierra Leone, I registered and graduated with a degree in economics. And from there, I worked for about 2 years at the University of Sierra Leone in the economics department, teaching, providing support to the professors, economics, macroeconomics, econometrics, and statistics, and generally quantitative economics. And then from there, I went to the UK, where I did a master's. And subsequently, I went to the US, where I started a PhD program in the Department of Applied Economics at the University of Minnesota. During that time, I got an internship from Rockefeller Foundation that took me to my first experience at the International Agricultural Research System, the CGIR, to Nigeria, and I was in Ibadan for about 2 years. From there, I came back, completed my degree, and then I started working with the Dean of the Humphrey Institute on a project supported by Sosakawa Global 2000 and the Carter Foundation to provide policy support for their programs in Africa. I did that for a year. After that, I joined the CGIR. We went to Addis for 2 years with the International Livestock Research Institute, the CGIR. It's a consultative group on international agricultural research. It's the network of international agricultural research centers. I was there for 2 years in Addis, and then I went to Nairobi, which is where I spent my most productive life. After Nairobi, I was at ICRISAT, International Crop Research Institute for Semi-Arid Tropics, in Nairobi, and then I joined the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi as a program director for one of the programs. From there, I joined the World Bank. Went to the bank, started with the evaluation department at the International Finance Corporation within the independent evaluation group. After that, I moved to the finance and private sector department. And then I moved to the Africa department. So you can see I had a very career within the bank, from evaluation to investments, advisory services, policy support. I spent over 10 years at the World Bank. It was a really interesting experience, worked across many different regions. And then from the bank, I joined the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. I spent the last 5 years of my professional career within the system, and I retired from the FAO recently. So that's been my journey. It's been very diverse, but quite interesting.
Wow.
And I think through that, I've learned a lot.
Extremely diverse and interesting. Diverse in terms of the country, the national and the regional perspectives you've had. Diverse in terms of the topic areas that you've worked on, from evaluation to investment. But you can see how all of that is related, because when you evaluate well, you're able to make better decisions. Can you tell me a little bit about what is it about economics that drove you to economics? That seems to be the connecting thread in everything that you've done.
From a very early age, growing up in Sierra Leone and at the University of Sierra Leone, I've always been interested in economic growth prospects, how businesses create jobs, how economies grow, how people make business decisions, and how they're supported by investments and policies, and how that leads to the improvement of lives. That has always been something that has motivated me. And for me, economics provided the sort of discipline that would tie these different things together. So it was very natural that because of this sort of interest and motivation that I had, that I took up a career in economics. And I've been privileged to cover diverse aspects of economics, from economic theory to quantitative economics to applied economics to development economics. All of this has shaped me into who I am as a professional. I don't know if I would have done well in any other discipline besides economics, because that motivation of understanding growth processes and how that leads to improvements in society and in people's lives has been a driver throughout my entire career. And it's something that still motivates me up to this day.
It's so interesting that you said you've always found economics interesting for you. For me, I discovered economics. I never thought I would enter into economics. So for me, it was very much psychology, all about people and emotions. Psychology has this very big thing that says that human beings are complex, we're not rational, which is a little different from some theories of economics. I remember being in meetings with some government officials talking about some economic growth challenges and economic growth issues. And there were some other economists in the room. And I go to myself, this is fascinating. This is interesting. There must be something there. So I was like, okay, let me go back to school. Let me go and get a master's in economics. It gives that foundation to understand decisions. Why are decisions made? How can you develop policy? And for me, for the first time, I could understand why some governments were doing some things that they were doing, why some markets were operating the way they were operating. And so I agree with you 100%. Can you tell me a little bit about what is it that you like about your career? What is it that you enjoy about it?
For me, the favorite thing about this journey is that I get to meet, talk, and learn from people from diverse walks of life, from politicians to policymakers, to CEOs of large companies, to SMEs, to farmers and young women and men, innovators, risk takers. I get to see the amazing opportunities that exist and how we can shift our focus from problems or challenges to solutions that could transform societies, transform economies, and improve the life of people. That for me is the most amazing part. That process of meeting people and learning from them and being part of co-creating solutions with others to turn complex problems into solutions that can make a difference in the lives of people and societies is what really motivates me. And that's what I enjoy the most. If I had to do it all over again, I would do it the same way. I will not change a bit.
What a blessing it is to be able to say that you have lived a life professionally that you would do over again. Not a lot of people can say that. Since you were talking about the progress that has happened in your career from when you started to now, what would you say has been some of the lessons that still stick to you, especially when it comes to supporting economic development and livelihoods?
One of the things that really sticks with me is building trusting relationships with the people that you work with. And it's mutual, mutual respect and trust in them, and they trust you and provide the resources for them, the environment for them to thrive. It's not something that I woke up and I knew by myself. I saw it in action. I saw it being applied to me.
How has that translated into how you have designed the projects that you worked on or your perspective on design?
Let's talk about SMEs, agri-SMEs as an example.
Mm.
You really need to be able to provide some very clear thought leadership and strategic direction in terms of where you want to go. I think that's part of the job of a leader. You need to be providing, not just alone, of course, but strategic directions. If it's about growing SMEs, what are some of the big issues involved? What are some of the big opportunities? How do you translate some of these constraints to opportunities? Once you have that yourself, my job is to bring the rest of the team along. And of course, in that team environment, this whole trusting relationship is that there are some people who are going to agree with you, some people are going to disagree with you, but you want to create an environment where you can have a dialogue, look at the diverse perspectives and look at the diverse views and encourage even those people that have contrary views to be able to talk about those views and provide supporting evidence. So whether we're talking about SMEs or we're talking about large companies, whatever the situation, I think providing that sort of environment for, first of all, the sort of strategic direction, thought leadership, harnessing all of that information and providing the right environment for dialogue and discussion and co-creating solutions, but also at the same time providing the resources and the environment that people will feel safe. So people start to trust you.
You brought in something when you were just talking right now, which is something new, but which also connects to the whole trust issues, which is the aspect of competency. You mentioned that it's important that you as a leader and also as a individual working with clients, that it's important for you yourself to be competent, for you to provide thought leadership.
The trust for me is a two-way. You have to trust people and people have to trust you. If you're not competent or you don't demonstrate the key competencies, I think it's going to be very difficult for people to trust you. People have to trust that what you say, it's reliable, it's evidence-based, you have the facts on your side.
And what would you say from your experience as some of those key resources you have used in your career to help you maintain that thought leadership? Because the world is changing. When I think back to when I went to school for economics and now it's a totally different world.
I'll try to break this up in two dimensions. So let's start to talk about if you design a project, an intervention, and this is all about how to empower SMEs. What are some of the thoughts or perspectives that you really want to build on? I think it's very important to understand the issue that you're dealing with, to bring all the evidence. So if we're looking at SMEs, what do we know about SMEs? SMEs are the backbone of economic transformation in many economies, including emerging economies and developing economies. So the first point, it does make a lot of sense to focus our attention on SMEs if we're talking about developing interventions that would drive economic transformation. Let me add a little bit of complexity to that. So let's focus on SMEs, the role that SMEs are playing in agri-food systems in Africa. I came across some recent data which indicate that SMEs form about 85% of the African private sector and food markets. 1 billion tons of food every year. That is equivalent to moving 300 million tons of food through the agricultural value chain to consumers. This is not a trivial space we're talking about. Imagine the business opportunity. In terms of where do they operate, they focus on urban markets, they focus on rural and regional markets. A lot of the food that is moving through urban markets, rural markets, and increasingly regional markets, they're coming from SMEs. And in doing so, they're providing goods and services, upstream value chains and downstream value chains. So they're pretty much key actors all along the value chains. So this is the potential. But we also need to acknowledge, why are they not at the frontier? Why have we not seen this potential unleashed? We need to understand that too.
Exactly.
If we look at a lot of the situations in African economies, the business environment facing SMEs remains unfavorable. SMEs don't tend to get a lot of support in terms of complementary public investments that can reduce transaction costs and risks. These are often either missing or undersupplied. And then, as you alluded to earlier on, African agri-food systems, they're facing significant financing and investment gaps. One estimate that I think we looked at when I was at FAO, it puts the financing gap about $180 billion US dollars annually. And SMEs, they're facing a gap out of this. The estimate for SMEs is about $65 billion annually. So with the opportunities and the constraints, it suggests to us that all of us, governments, development agencies, financiers, business advisory firms. We certainly need to do more to unleash this huge potential of SMEs to drive transformation in the agri-food system. These are some of the issues we should face head on, because therein you see the opportunities, but also what is holding them back. And, if we can work on these things to really co-create solutions that makes a lot of sense for everybody, then we can actually see tremendous growth driven by SMEs in agri-food system, but in other sectors in Africa and other developing regions. So these are some of the issues that I think we consider when we're talking about designing development interventions for SMEs.
For me, it's interesting that when I open any articles, journals, or recent papers, recent communications, a lot of the challenges around the fact that this tremendous power that SMEs have is not being unleashed, the perspective that it can and it should be unleashed, has been the same since I was in school over a decade ago. Access to financing was talked about. It's still being talked about. Issues on capacity aspects has been talked about, is still being talked about. And so for me, it leads me to the question of, what is it that we're not doing? Why is it that we're still talking about these issues? Do we need to be a little bit more audacious in how we're tackling these issues? Are we not co-creating enough with the SMEs to really push this forward? So there's all these questions going on in my head, which I am sure you yourself have thought about countlessly. What are your thoughts and perspective on that we're still having pretty much some of the same conversations that have been going on for years?
Absolutely. I think you're spot on with that. These issues are not new. We know them. The difference, I say, is that it's not about what we do, but how we're doing things. I think that is the change. It's not about what we do. We know a lot about what we need to do, but really the opportunity is how we're going to be doing business. Really, it's about financing, and you talked about the proportion of SMEs getting access to credit. But what we know now, and if we look at that investment gap, we know that there is no way public financing is going to fill that gap.
Exactly.
We're going to need increased private financing flows. But even with those increased financing flows, we need to be a lot more innovative to make sure that the right kind of financing is available for the stage of growth in which the SME is at. For example, recently these days when we're talking about financing that shows a lot more promise, we're talking about blended finance, where we can blend public finance and private finance. Right. We're talking about innovative financing instruments that include risk management options that make sense for SMEs. We're not just talking about debt. We're talking about equity. We're talking about how we can ensure that matching grants are linked to commercial finance. So it's a lot about how we're doing it. We see a lot more promise because these instruments are really getting to the heart of the problem that we're seeing. But also, we're not just talking about financing as provide finance. No, increasingly, finance yields the expected returns. When we combine it with business advisory services, you can get all the money in the world. But if you don't understand the market that you're going to be operating in, the logistics are not right, you don't know your customers and all these things we talk about, you're never going to be able to deliver as expected. So I think it's the how to that is different. How do you make use of innovation, innovative financing instruments, innovative institutional arrangements? How do you look at innovative payment systems? I think the whole ecosystem supporting SMEs has to be there. I talked about the policy. You're going to need the supportive policies. You're going to need the public investments. You're going to need the right kind of financing instruments working. You're going to need the right sort of business advisory services working. And we know that when those things are there, SMEs have stood up to the challenge. They're growing. I worked in the Africa region for many years. There are a lot of very innovative SMEs that are at the forefront, not just in urban and rural markets, but in international markets. So it's about that way. I think what is lacking is, do we have the sort of public policy support that would bring all of these things together? I think that is where we're missing a lot of these things, making sure that we have the right policies, the infrastructure is there, the private sector provide that kind of financing and risk management instruments, and SMEs have the capacity to upgrade with the right kind of business advisory support to be able to not just enter a new market, but expand a new market. I'm optimistic because I've seen these things happen together. The SMEs that we see in Africa, they're very dynamic, they're very innovative, they're very business savvy. Increasingly, they're led by young people like you, young women and men like you. I get to interact with these people all the time. And this is what I said, this is different. For those of us who worked in Africa for a long time, or developing countries for a long time, let me speak to Africa for a minute. A lot of times when I talk to young people, young entrepreneurs, business owners, SMEs, business owners, women and men, the conversation is different. In the past, when you talk to people, they'll tell you, oh, the problem is this, the problem is that. Increasingly, when we're talking to SME owners, the more dynamic, growth-oriented, they're not talking about the problem. They're talking about the opportunities. Really, the focus is on opportunities. And the focus is, how can I benefit from this opportunity? How can I be part of this growth? So they have increasingly a growth mindset. So I think that is very different. And to the extent that we're seeing a lot of young people founding and being CEOs and chief operating officers in these companies, the future is very bright. And that is why I'm very optimistic. They are ambitious. They are not afraid. They're innovative. They're willing to try. They're willing to share their experiences. They're willing to explore frontier markets. And I think the fact that it's oriented towards growth makes a big difference.
So I'm going to ask you a question because I agree with you that in the private sector, it is very much of a growth mindset. How about let's flip this to the agencies and the entities giving funds, to the multilaterals and so forth. What is your perspective on that? How has things changed within that development space?
I think there are huge mega trends that are driving growth opportunities. The best opportunities happen when things are changing rapidly. And I think development institutions have a lot to catch up with, particularly with regards to private sector development, entrepreneurship. This is a conversation that I have a lot of times. Let me give you an example. If you look at agri-food systems, right? A lot of the conversation is on smallholder farmers, but the bulk of the food is moved by SMEs. But how many times do we pay attention 85%. To SMEs? We call them the missing middle. A lot of organizations they don't even have an agenda on SMEs. So there's a lot of catching up to do. And I think a lot of honest people will say that. But the good thing is, the way I see it, is that there are multiple sources of innovation. And like I keep saying, that the driver in all of this is going to be innovation, the opportunities for innovation. And it's going to come from the public sector and the private sector. So I think we need to be able to appreciate those things and look for those sources of innovation and how we can work with them. And a lot of this, like I said, is going to come from the young people who are the owners, the founders, and the CEOs of these SMEs themselves, providing a strong demand side perspective on some of these things. One of the exciting things that I see within the public sector financing organizations is this greater move towards blended finance, where they put in their own resources, but also trying to crowd in private financing and through that to be able to create products that are more appropriate, not just for farmers, which is a key constituency, but also SMEs and large companies. I think these are some of the changes that gives me optimism. So my thinking is that with this sort of dynamic, these trends, these mega trends that are driving growth opportunities, particularly in Africa, these organizations will have to change. They don't have a choice. Otherwise, they're not going to be relevant. And if you're not relevant, you're going to be out of business.
I agree with you a lot when you say this is really an opportunity environment that we're in. There's a lot going on right now. Big institutions are trying. They need to adapt. The bank's motto now is a better bank. And I was like, this is a little different. As you said, there is that understanding that we are at a critical junction right now in terms of how we design projects, how we implement projects, and how we exit from projects. I think that's also something we need to also be talking about. It's also thinking about exiting. It's very common in the private sector to have your mindset of how you're going to exit. You're going to sell your company, you're going to do something else. But that's not really a mindset that is very common.
Right.
So I'll just transition us a little bit into the design aspect of interventions, especially in terms of the future in mind, in terms of what is currently going on and what the future opportunities potentially are. Which leads me to the question of how are you perceiving design of these interventions now? Or how do you see that they're different from how you've done it before?
That's an excellent question, Edna. Really, because design has to have a forward-looking perspective. Let me take you through some of the things that comes to mind and that I also do when I'm designing interventions. Just some key steps we can build around that. The first thing for me is when I'm thinking about design, it involves both process and content. A lot of times we say we're going to design, but what does that mean? So I think of that as a process, a design process. There are processes along the way. And then there are content issues. What are you going to do? So I think the first thing that I do and the teams that I work with is to have a clear perspective on both the process issues and the content issues. With that in mind, one of the first things that I think is very important in designing interventions that are likely to lead to growth opportunities is to try to understand what is driving growth. What are the key trends? Let me give you an example. So let's take agri-food systems in Africa as an example. If we look at agri-food systems in Africa, some of the mega trends are creating big opportunities for future growth for businesses, SMEs, and large companies. Let's just reflect on some of the things. First, we know that African food markets are growing, estimated to be about $1 trillion by 2030. We also see that markets in Africa are becoming increasingly integrated, regional markets. A big part of this is due to the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has a combined GDP of about $3 trillion and about 1 billion people. When we look at Africa, we see the demographic trends. It's a young, rapidly growing, and increasingly urbanized population. Another big trend that we see in Africa and other parts of the world is accelerated adoption of new technologies, including digital technologies. And these provide fertile ground for innovation. So understanding these trends, these mega trends, it provides value insights into future growth prospects. And it also helps investors and development practitioners identify strategic investment opportunities for building profitable and sustainable businesses. This is very important. You really need to be able to ask yourself, where are the future growth prospects? And what is driving those prospects? And looking at trends is where you get those answers. Now, we know where the future and the growth opportunities are. The second thing in terms of design that I really think is very important is the engagement process. You engage with your clients to better understand their needs, their perspectives, their motivations, etc. But it's also important to engage with other key stakeholders, governments who set policies, and we talked about the policy environment, industry association, because they're also trying different things, investors, business advisory services who are working in this area, because you also want to get their perspectives on the opportunities and constraints that are holding the sector back. So I think that engagement process is very important. Armed with this information on the trends and perspectives from different actors, I think we then get into collecting data. I'm a believer in getting good quality data and other relevant information that you can use in design. This might include things like pre-investment and investment analysis, feasibility studies, any kind of due diligence that is relevant. This is important to build the evidence base that informs product design. Yeah. Good product design is grounded on solid data and evidence. You need that to be able to look at the opportunities, to look at different scenarios and have a good conversation. And here there are a number of issues that I like to consider. I'll frame this around key questions. Basically, you ask yourself, what is the product trying to achieve? What are we trying to do here? And also how the project is going to deliver these outputs, including key processes and the implementation plan. Typically, in project design speak, we're talking about
exactly.
The components, the project objectives and project components, etc. But I think it's important that we're not just talking about the content, but also processes. A lot of times you see people design something, we're going to create 100 new SMEs. Who said we need 100 SMEs? How are we going to do this? These are very important questions that we need to challenge ourselves. It's not just what we're going to do, but how we're going to do it. And how are we going to deliver this? If we don't have the financing and the business advisory services, how is this going to happen? So I think we need to challenge ourselves, project designers and implementers, on this sort of very difficult questions. If we're successful with that, it's very important to focus on developing what I call integrated and multidisciplinary solutions. This, in my view, should draw from the best technical and operational expertise available. Implementation has a lot to do with operational issues. Design might have to do with tech, but I think it's both technical and operations. This is important. For example, the likelihood of success is much higher when we have different things, the enabling environment, the financing, and all these things coming together, the sort of ecosystem coming together. That was the point we made. If there's a missing piece, it is very unlikely that you're going to be successful. So we really need to have that big picture perspective. When I'm looking at these integrated solutions, some of the things in my toolkit that I like to explore would be questions such as how the project is using innovation and technology to improve efficiency. It can be along the supply chain or the value chain or in the delivery of services. But I think for me, innovation and technology is a big part of that conversation. Remember, we talked about the trends, right? So this is where we bring those trends to bear in terms of
into the
creating
conversation.
solutions. Another question, and we also need to ask ourselves the questions in this at the design phase is, what do we need to do? What are some of the actions that we need to take to move SMEs from startups to commercially viable agribusinesses? This is a part of the conversation. We're co-creating the solutions, right? I would like to have a conversation, not just with the SMEs, but within the industry itself. How are we going to move from startups, even with the financiers? What sort of support? Are we thinking of the life cycle of financing? At the start, you need seed financing. As you grow, you might need some kind of matching grant financing. And then as you grow, you need some sort of equity-based financing. And then when you can sustain debt, you can get debt. If you're not generating cash flow, you cannot sustain debt. We need to have those conversations, right? In terms of the design phase to say, even if I'm sitting with the financier, that's a conversation we should be having. At what stage would it be appropriate to provide equity? So you can get people who can bring us financing, but technical assistance, technical support. At what stage does it make sense to have debt? So those are conversations we should be having. And that is one of the problems. That conversation doesn't happen enough. And because it doesn't happen, you find that companies grow, establish, they remain startups forever. And even though we try with incubators and accelerators, but really, I don't think we have those conversations to the level of detail that will allow these companies to have a seamless growth pattern from startups to commercial viable. One of the things I also think is very important, we don't talk about it a lot, is how we deal with risk and uncertainty. Businesses involve risks. How are risks being identified? Do we have a solid risk mitigation plan? We need to have those conversations. The other thing is uncertainty. We cannot predict uncertainty. We know about risk, but we cannot predict uncertainty. We need to be able to look at the environment and different scenarios that can play out. COVID-19 was a classic example. It hit the world. The companies that were able to look at different scenarios were the ones who were able to adjust and pivot.
Exactly.
By the companies that didn't do anything about it, were still, some of them even closed down. Those companies that were able to deal with that sort of level of uncertainty and the effects that it was having on their business were able to pivot. And these things are very important. And then finally, I think in design, I'm a big believer that you need to have a monitoring, evaluation, and learning system. This should include having a dashboard on your KPIs, your key performance indicators, because this will help management of the business, even an SME, make mid-course correction if necessary. It can also help
SMEs are like, they're big with monitoring and evaluation. They're looking at their data. They're looking at their numbers.
Absolutely. And I've seen, I was in Kenya and I visited an SME. It was fascinating how they're using SaaS as software as a service to develop the dashboard, which can tell you everything you need to know about the business and how those information on the buyers, the quantities supplied, the quality supplied, quantities returned, what happened to those, and it helps them make better decisions. I think that is the direction we need to support SMEs to move into so that they can make better decisions to improve their performance. These are some of the key things that I consider when I'm thinking of design. Of course, it's not exhaustive, but I think it's a good place to start.
I think you've just laid out such a rich body of knowledge. And if I can just recap a little bit so I can make sure I myself got that. One of the things I picked up is that you talked about engagement, not only understanding the trends, which is really important because the trends tell you where the opportunities are, but you mentioned having diversity in perspectives. So you can see not only from the SME's perspective, maybe from the industry, from the government and so forth. So that's going to give you a good overall holistic picture of what's going on. And then you talked about integrated multidisciplinary teams. All you're saying makes such good sense. And especially in terms of monitoring and evaluation, when I speak to somebody in the private sector, I can have wonderful conversations about data, about monitoring, about tracking, and how it's used for management tools. When I talk about monitoring and evaluation, sometimes within the development space, it's a bit tricky. It's the last thing we want to consider. It's too much information, it's too much nitty-gritty and so forth. But that's important. If private sector entities are using that as core to what they're doing, why aren't we using that when we are trying to help them? It just makes sense.
It's a conundrum that does occupy my mind too. And there are a couple of observations. I talked recently, and I just told you about the company we visited in Kenya. They're big on data, digital data. They've digitized the whole system. Then I talked to another company in Rwanda. In fact, the CEO told me data is life because that's what they used to inform their investors. That's what they used to raise money, etc. He said data is for them is life. This is where I see the conundrum. For too long, we have been seeing SMEs as a development sector. We haven't seen them through an investment lens. This is my observation. For too long, it's a development sector. We need to help them. We need to support them. We don't see SMEs as savvy investors, growth-minded investors who are looking at very clear opportunities that they want to exploit. I think a lot of development, we see them through the development lens, that it's a development sector, whereas I think the appropriate perspective and the appropriate lens is through an investment lens because they're investors taking risks and looking for reward. It's a risk-reward calculation. Development organizations don't see it that way. They look at development. So there might be some common ground, but in terms of motivation, they're different. I think it is understanding those differences in motivation that makes it different. And that is why I think, for example, the sort of work that you're doing at Kallon Global, I would encourage you to look at it from the investment perspective, the investment lens, because that is where I see the promise. That's where I see the opportunities. That's where I see the potential to bring about the change that we're talking about. When we're talking about having different perspectives or talking to different actors when you're engaging. I had a situation once, we're looking at regional value chains and we're talking about the different actors. And it so happened that we talked to everybody except the people who are dealing with logistics. Imagine, right? We're talking about trade. The only reason why we got to talk to the people who are involved in logistics was because we mapped these different key stakeholders. Logistics turned out to be not just the biggest constraint, but the biggest growth opportunity that we saw to move things quickly. And we saw how the folks in logistics, and these were young people too, how they were innovating, how they were innovating to move at a lower cost and quicker and ensuring that there's information flowing between the customer. How many times do you do a value chain analysis and you talk to people who deal with logistics? A lot of times.
No, a lot of, even when I speak to people who are designing these projects, logistics is it's considered boring.
It is the oil that makes this thing flow. It's very important when you're having those engagements to really have that big picture perspective, understand the key stakeholders, the key actors in the system, and really try to reach out to them because they are making the investment decisions. That is the big thing. I also talk to colleagues who did work on value chain and say there are priorities for value chains. Good. Government set priorities for value chains. It's a good place to start. But I always say, listen, governments don't make investments in value chains. They provide the enabling environment, they provide the complementary environment, but the investments on value chains are made by private actors. You need to talk to them. You need to get their perspective on the opportunities and constraints as they see them. You need to get their perspective on the market opportunities as they see them. You need to get their perspective on what is holding them back. You need to get their perspective on how they're engaging with the other actors. Without that, it's not likely to succeed. So I think those are the different perspectives we need to bring into the design philosophy, give people the tools and the ability to explore the opportunities they see.
I agree 100%. And you're right. This is exactly what Kallon Global is about. Our motto is to empower individuals so that they can self-actualize. Because we believe that individuals themselves, they probably thought about solutions to these challenges that they face. Countless times, they probably have ideas. So how do we empower them to self-actualize? How do we empower them to unleash that potential that they have? I am part of the generation who think that we need to give more power to these individuals who are the ones closest to these challenges because they have thought about it. How do we empower them? For me, when I say empowerment, I talk about the ability to build assets, the ability to use assets, and the ability to self-actualize using those assets. When I talk about assets, it's not just financial assets. There's so many ways to look at assets, but how do you help people build them, to use them, which is important. And you said something interesting earlier, which I thought was really fascinating when you talked about the process and you're talking about like how SMEs have different stages in which they need different types of financing, from startup financing to more equity financing to maybe debt is the last thing you want to think about, which for me is about understanding that process in which SMEs go through. And I think at the same time, policymakers also need to understand those processes. And they need to be able to create policies that are aware of those processes. So, for example, they wouldn't say a company in a startup phase has to do the same thing that a company able to take on debt can do. There's just so many aspects. And for me, one of the things I hear a lot about, which I just want to challenge, is that some people say there's so many nuances and they just have to find a common ground. It's easier to find a common ground and then put everybody on that same ground. But I am more on the perspective that if we have a desired outcome in mind, we have to think about all the people along the chain to be able to reach that outcome.
Let me pick up on a few things you said, and just to sort of elaborate a little bit on my thinking. It's very important to have in mind these two perspectives on process and content. How many times do you go into a policy conversation and talk about the SME growth process and the financing that is appropriate? That conversation doesn't happen simply because we don't look at the growth process for SMEs or the life cycle of SME growth. We don't. We go there and we say, okay, you're going to provide access to finance. It doesn't work like that. Which brings me to the next point that you made. I think for me, it's very important to always think about context. And I think tailor-made solutions are more likely to provide successful outcomes than generic solutions. You're not going to provide credits and stuff like that. You really need to be able to think about the context in which these different farms are operating and then give them access to the kind of support that will help them to grow. Which brings me to the point that you made, and I know this is a big part of what Kalila Global is doing, and rightly so. It's this whole question about empowerment. I'm cynically in some sense, particularly when it comes to some of these concepts, empowerment, ecosystem. We can list a trail of these things. And the reason why I think probably cynical is a strong word, but I'll use it anyway for want of a better word. Because I think for me, it's very important that we actually try to be clear about what these things mean.
Exactly.
What these things mean. We really need to be able to break these things down into concrete terms. When I think about SMEs, what does empowerment of SMEs mean?
To look like?
Yeah, for me, it's about giving them access to data, information, knowledge, tools, networks, and resources that should enable them to make better investments. Why are we doing that? It should help you either upgrade or make better decisions. If you can't make better decisions, then I'm not empowering you. I think it's very important with these concepts to be very clear in terms of what they mean and in a way that the clients, policymakers, and others can relate to, because that way you can know if there are gaps, if there are certain things that you're doing that you should not be doing.
When I was thinking about how we're going to define it, I was specific on the building of assets, the use of assets, and the self-actualization using those assets. And the reason why we use assets is because I believe that what is considered an asset is dependent upon what we are talking about and what it is we want to get to at the end of the day. So as you yourself have told me right now, data is an asset for SMEs. Information is an asset for SMEs. Capacity building is important for SMEs. But then you also talk about them being able to use it. You want them to make better decisions. You want them to be able to grow. So that's the use. The conversation I want to have with people when I go in with Kalila Global is that this is our definition of empowerment. Let's talk about how this would look like in the specific sector or the specific area that you are working on. Right. As a template, they have to fill in. We believe strongly that when they complete that template, they would know what it is they would need to do and where they need to go. And for them to be able to complete that simple template, it means they're going to have to engage. It means they're going to have to get the knowledge they need. It means that they're going to have to ask some difficult questions. And so let's start that conversation with throwing that idea after you and let's build that.
I think part of empowering, it's really encouraging, providing a platform for experience sharing, running the business, exploiting opportunities, dealing with different kind of challenges, some of the best practices that they see that are working for them. I think that's very empowering because when SMEs are there or actors are there and they're hearing what others are doing, because remember, you're talking about somebody that you put in the same, you're all SMEs, you're probably same asset class, facing similar problems, and you relate better. It's like you're with your peers. Pretty much. And I think there's this willingness to share this information. I found that to be very empowering. Provided these platforms for experience sharing, I think it's very powerful.
You're making my mind think now, Ade. Kalina's going to build that platform.
I'll be very happy.
And we're going to want you to facilitate that platform.
I'll be very happy to work with you on that. We can even make it bigger than just SMEs, because now you've got my thought process all over the place.
Yes.
No, but on a serious note, I think it's something that we should work on. It's something that I think is really empowering. Yeah, it's important.
I feel like we can keep on talking because you have a lot of knowledge. So now I want to ask you one final question. If there is two to take away from this conversation, what would you say are those two nuggets to hold on to?
You asked for two, I'll give you three. The first is that, where we have policy and a business environment that is favorable, where you have complementary public investments, and where SMEs have access to appropriate financing and advisory services, they provide the most promising pathways for inclusive and sustainable growth in agri-food systems in Africa. The evidence is there. Look at what they're doing now. Imagine what they could do if we can empower them to make better business and investment decisions. They can be the engine of growth. I have no doubt about that. The second thing, which I think is also important, is that when I look at SMEs and we look at SMEs in the region, in Africa, on the continent, they're run by very dynamic, innovative, and savvy businesswomen and men. They see this as an investment opportunity, not a development opportunity. So I think government, development agencies, all of us who work in other stakeholders, we really need to see them through an investment lens rather than a development lens. I think it's very important that we shift that focus from development to investment. They're not contradictory, but I think then we start to get a better sense of the motivations underpinning the decisions that they're making. And then the final point I want to make, which is in addition to this, and we keep coming back to, but it goes back to the trends that we talked about. My observation, and I work a lot in the Africa region, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, it's young women and men, young women like you, Edna, who are the founders and CEOs of SMEs. We hosted a leadership dialogue, and at least 75% of the people there were CEOs, were youth, running successful businesses. That's the trend. We see in Africa, they see the opportunities, the trends that we talked about. I have a lot of faith in the demographic trends we've seen. And I don't believe that with the vision and the growth mindset that these young people have, I think it provides the best opportunity to transform Africa's demographic dividend into an economic transformation. So I'm optimistic about the growth prospects. But like I said earlier on the first point, we need to get our acts together and really provide the support that would help them to make the business and investment decisions that they need to make to transform not just their businesses, but the growth opportunities in agri-food systems on the African continent.
Thank you so much, Ade. This has just been so enriching, and oh my goodness, I feel like I need to probably have a part 2 of this at some point when we talk some more. It really is a pleasure. And I am going to draw us to a close of this episode. And one of the things we like to have at the end of our episode is what we call outside of work, which is a series of 3 rapid questions to get to know individuals behind all the accomplishments. We want to get to know who you are when you're not working. What do you do for fun and so forth? So I'm going to give you 3 questions. Whatever comes to your mind first, you say it. The first question is, if there are 3 books or articles or journals that you would recommend people to read, what would you say those 3 are?
I'll talk about a book that I enjoyed reading and I've read it over and over again. It's a very interesting book because it has to do with life. It's the book Who Moved My Cheese by Spencer Johnson. I like this book because it's all about what we've been talking about. It's all about a change in context and ability to recognize that change is happening, adapt to change, and make better decisions to get a good outcome. I love that book, and I recommend it all the time. The second, I read The Economist. It's one way of getting worldviews, the economic spin to it, and the policy. But my favorite book of all time is the Bible. That's where I got the source of my inspiration. That's where I get encouragement. The Bible overseas, all other books for me. So.
Those are 3 really good ones. The second question, because I love to travel, can you let me know a travel destination you would recommend and why?
I'll have to settle for Malindi on the Kenya coast. I just like the laid back ambience. I love the people, the Swahili culture. I love the food, the music. I go there and I forget about the rest of the world.
And the final question, if you could have dinner with one historical figure, who would it be?
That's an easy one. Without a doubt, it's Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was the first president of Ghana. And as you know, I lived in Ghana for many years. During that time, I had an opportunity to see some of the public investments made under his administration. He really invested in the fundamentals to transform the society in a meaningful way. Imagine, the Akosombo Dam was built, and that dam provides energy in Ghana and neighboring countries. They had a Tema industrial city and the Tema harbor, which opened up the country and the region to trade. There was the investment in the Kwame Nkrumah's University of Science and Technology and the industrial zones, which could have formed the basis for special economic zones. We looked at it: energy, science and tech, trade, and industrialization. Those are the fundamentals of growth. So I would have really liked to talk to him and have a conversation with him on how he envisions Africa's economic transformation into the 21st century, particularly with the continent's growing youthful population and the prospects for accelerated innovation. As in, I'm not talking about politics here, I'm talking about development. It would have been good to have that dinner with him and have that conversation and see what he thinks about how he envisions this continent in the next 50 years.
I would love to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. That would be such a handful. You just sit there and listen to him impart his wisdom.
That would be such a good blueprint for unleashing the potential of this continent.
Wow, what an incredible conversation we've had, Ade. I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights, stories, wisdom, and experience with us. Personally, I have learned a lot about leadership. I've learned a lot about designing projects. I've learned a lot about how empowerment looks like for SMEs. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure talking to you. You inspire me in very interesting ways. So I think to the extent that we can find time to share our thoughts, our views, our perspective on different things and use it to improve what we're doing and what we're trying to do with others, we're all the better off for that. I enjoyed this conversation. It's really a pleasure.
Thank you. I just want to say as well to the listeners, I hope this episode has sparked some new ideas for you on how you can contribute to solving some of the world's biggest challenges, whether it is in agriculture or beyond. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Connect with us on Instagram at Audacity and Action, the podcast, on LinkedIn at Kalena Global, Kalena, so that you can share your comments and insights. Until next time, keep being audacious and keep thinking differently. This is Audacity and Action, and I am your host, Edna Kallon. See you next time.